Well, this is big. The Supreme Court this morning heard oral arguments in the case that could kick Trump off the ballot. And I want to bring in Aaron Parnas, our legal expert, to break this down. What is going on here? Give us the latest.
Yeah, so the case is Trump versus Anderson. It arises out of the Colorado Supreme Court. If you remember, the Supreme Court a couple months ago in a 4-3 decision held that Donald Trump violated the 14th Amendment's insurrection clause, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. And the court essentially kicked him off the ballot, but stayed that decision pending a resolution in front of the United States Supreme Court. And this morning, the United States Supreme Court heard argument from Trump's team and also from the group behind the effort to essentially kick Trump off the ballot that initially sued in Colorado. So oral argument was held this morning, and now we wait for a decision.
And give me the outline sort of the argument coming from Trump's side and the argument coming from the kick Trump off side.
Yeah, so it's actually interesting. The Trump's main argument, and remember, so we're on appeal. So the facts of the case don't matter as much because you're dealing with legal issues. You're not dealing with factual issues on appeal. So Trump's team argued two things. First, that the president is not within the confines of the 14th Amendment's insurrection clause. The president doesn't fall within that clause. So that's number one. Number two, Trump's team argued that if you find that the president does come under the 14th Amendment, then it's up to it's up to Congress, not the courts, to decide whether to kick someone off the ballot. So that was their two main arguments. They didn't argue that Trump did not engage in insurrection because that was a purely factual issue that was already decided by a lower court.
Gotcha. And before getting to the other side's argument, let me read for everybody just to kind of refresh your memory. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. No person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of president and vice president or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state who, having previously taken oath as a member of Congress or as an officer of the United States or as a member of any state legislature or as an executive or judicial officer of any state to support the Constitution of the United States shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. So the argument that we've talked about in the past from Trump's side is that the president is not an officer of the United States. Where do you fall on that?
Essentially, yeah. I mean, I think it's an interesting argument. I don't think it is super legally sound or historically sound based on the text of the Constitution, but they're making the argument because if you read the clause in full, you see that it mentions senators, members of the House, electors, but it doesn't actually mention the president or vice president for that matter earlier on in the clause. So they're arguing, hey, this clause was written by the founders to simply include Congress and the electors. This wasn't written to include the president and the vice president. Personally, I think that argument is flawed. I think that a president is considered an officer of the United States, considering the president takes an oath, just like any member of Congress would, to protect and defend and serve the United States Constitution, essentially. So I would fall, and I think the Supreme Court will also agree that the president is an officer of the United States under Section 3, but I don't know if it'll be a unanimous decision.
Interesting. And so then reiterate the argument coming from those trying to kick Trump off the ballot.
Yeah, the argument on their side is simply Trump engaged in insurrection. He is an officer of the United States, and the judiciary, the courts, are a perfectly acceptable place to decide whether or not a presidential candidate can remain on the ballot. It's really that simple. This appeal is not coming from the side that's trying to kick Trump off the ballot. The appeal is coming from Trump's team. So they're the ones putting forth these novel legal arguments to attempt to keep Trump on the ballot. So we'll see what happens.
Okay. And in the case of, for example, if you're not of the proper age and there's a legal challenge to that, or you're not a citizen who was born in the United States and there's a legal challenge to that, that would be decided in the courts, right?
You would typically take that to the courts, yeah. And the federal courts would typically issue some type of injunction maybe at first while the case is pending to keep someone off the ballot, and then you'd have a fact-finding mission if you're not old enough or if you're not from the United States, naturally born citizen. you would be removed off the ballot. I mean, it's really that simple.
And so I wanted to make those comparisons as we launch into this clip, and then I'll explain why.
Perhaps I think the one that they inevitably will take is the Colorado case, because that really goes to the heart of, can you have judges preventing the voters from voting for one of the major two parties' nominees, assuming Donald Trump is the nominee? And by the way, Colorado, they're trying to take him off the primary ballot. I don't think the Supreme Court, I think they're going to reverse that quite easily. I think that decision is utterly lawless. The main decision is even more laughable. And more we see in courts, we see at the Department of Justice, we see among elected Democrats, we see in the corporate media. They are motivated just by this overwhelming hatred of Donald Trump, and they're corrupt.
So it's just important that people remember these arguments of this is lawless or this is taking away people's right to vote or not letting them have the options they want. It's as much that as age restrictions. If indeed Section 3 of the 14th Amendment applies to Trump's actions, then just constitutionally he would have to be barred from the ballot. This is just a matter of upholding the Constitution. So we'll let the courts figure out if indeed it applies. But it really bothers me that people try to act like this is some outside of the Constitution effort, outside of a democratic process effort. This is what having a constitutional republic looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And I also think there's one important caveat here is that, say the Supreme Court decides, you know what, a state like Colorado has the right to kick Trump off the ballot. He violated the 14th Amendment's insurrection clause. Let's say they hold that. Then it's going to be going back to the states, because we know the Supreme Court loves states' rights, and we know that we live in a federalist system where each state essentially authorizes and conducts its own elections. So you will see states like Colorado, states like Maine, likely remove Trump off their ballot. But then you will see other states, like, for example, Minnesota or even Michigan, who have already come out and said that they may not be as willing to remove Trump off the ballot. He may stay on the ballot in those states. So you may end up getting a scenario where Trump is on the ballot in half the country, but kicked off the ballot in the other half the country.
Yeah, and I've been saying, as I've seen many others say as well, I'll admit, I think it would be more satisfying to have Trump lose in the general election, and he loses because he just doesn't get enough votes compared to Joe Biden. But again, you can't selectively apply the Constitution. So we'll see how it all plays out, but you do have to abide by that principle, and that's being decided right now by the courts. Aaron, where can people find you?
On all my social media platforms, just at Aaron Parnas.